Did you just join? Oh, I don't
We're
know.
live. Are we here? Both of
Oh,
us?
I guess that's we're experiencing the lag right now. So this is something we'll note for future podcasts. Um,
So you're looking at you from
Now
not
we're on our YouTube screen is on. So I'm going to let's just go.
okay. We're here talking with the inaugural episode of our book club, and we wanted to learn a little bit about socialism. It's in the air with the Bernie Sanders campaign. Rest in peace for that.
Maybe
And
not. You know, who knows?
well, yeah, maybe who knows with the convention and everything. But in any case, we are looking at the ABCs of Socialism, edited by Bhaskar Sunkara. Sorry if I mispronounced that. The editor of Jacobin magazine and prominent leftist type of guy. I wanted to start with who this book is meant for. Scout, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I mean, so the book is the book is actually very well titled, "The ABCs of Socialism," because it is kind of, with all respect to the authors, it's an elementary, content book. It's not very substance heavy. I actually feel like, as someone who's like technically minded, I have a lot more questions maybe. But I actually think in the same way, the book is really helpful in understanding certain things, giving more clarity to certain concepts than maybe I had before I read the book. I think the intended audience is probably just the average Joe, for lack of a better way of putting it. Um, and it's kind of someone who's a little more novice to politics, or I'll say specifically political science. Um, and I actually think in terms of maybe that target audience, the book is really well done, um, because it's not, no, it wasn't boring. It wasn't particularly, how do I say, like it didn't it really went through a lot without going into any one thing in particular too much. It was really explanative in some ways, but not in all ways. It was just kind of like a really good 101.
Yeah, which is what we wanted, right? We didn't want to get overwhelmed. In some ways, I'm a little embarrassed that this is the first book of our book club because I actually think it's meant for kids a little bit. There's like drawings in between the chapters and like large fonts that summarize the argument that's made. It's pretty breezy. It's kind of like it has a snappy, humorous kind of tone. Like one of the chapters is called "Will Socialists Take Away My Kenny Loggins Records?" That seems like it's meant for someone who's older, with the Kenny Loggins reference. But it's like people who have really shallow objections that are like, I think socialism is bad for this very elementary novice reason. And this book will take care of that and hopefully put a positive spin on your interpretation. But I guess maybe this goes along with it being meant for kids. It fails to address probably the central objection to socialism, which is that it's responsible for killing millions of people. Yeah, arguably, certainly socialist regimes have been responsible for a lot of famine, a lot of oppression, and a lot of death. And they don't really go into that. I don't think they go into anything really heavy here.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we were talking before this recording about like our thoughts and just kind of prepping for the discussion, and I landed on something that was interesting, that I think that there's kind of like an advocative element there too. So I think that they're trying to really like elucidate the nicer, and the more, what might be considered like the more persuasive aspects of socialism. Knowing that they have to kind of like defend all of these maybe misconceptions or dramatic counterfactuals, about socialism. And I think that there maybe part of that was coming from a place of that. I think that's evidenced by the Kenny Loggins reference, but also like the pictures and the kind of, like light feel of the content matter. Um, so just like an interesting aside, because I think another thing about this is that, there's just this really this a strong emphasis on like not only struggle but really the need to like advocate and push for issues. And I also think that that's kind of like woven into their style of writing a little bit. It's very like advocative.
Yeah, and this goes along with it being meant for young people. It's very hopeful, and it's sort of like we don't like capitalism because there are these injustices that inherently spring from it, and we really believe in a better world. We believe in human creativity, and just flourishing. This can't be acceptable. There's got to be a better way. That's sort of like the tone of a lot of it. Um, we should say briefly our backgrounds. I would say we're both progressive leaning, Bernie Sanders supporters, but not really formally ready to take on the definition, the title or identity of socialist. And I'm skeptical of that. I believe that it's very possible that capitalism is immoral and unfair and corrupt in certain very hard to change ways, but it might be the best thing that we have. I'm not at all convinced that they can articulate a real vision of what they want, and they don't even really try too much. So, do you want to say a little bit too about your self-identification, maybe, and the definition of
Yeah.
socialism?
So like I am a progressive, a very, I would maybe say radical progressive. I think this book has actually made me lean a little bit more towards the label of democratic socialism, though I'm not like ready to like dive in. I'm interested. You know, I think that there are a lot of second and third questions that I have. Um, and I think that it doesn't necessarily have to be like this dichotomy between like capitalism and socialism. I think that like there's something in between, but I think that I think a lot of the questions that I have weren't really described in the book because I kind of have like technical questions about like what does like government ownership of means of production mean, which is like a theme that's strewn throughout the
Yeah,
essays.
and what does about abolition of private property, or
Yeah,
yeah, private property? They said.
abolition of private property. Yeah. You know, so like those are questions that I'm really curious about. Um, and you know, different aspects around like specifically like what would the administrative regime be that like carries out socialist policies. You know, because I kind of have this going into this, go in a little bit more by my background. Going into this, I kind of had like this really translucent concept of what socialism meant. You know, I kind of didn't really answer the questions about what socialism looks like today. My concept was always based on like what I would consider like Marxist socialism, like this very rigid thing. Because again, this is all from secondary sources. This is my first time really diving into the world of socialism, we'll say. But what I understood about socialism before this book was that Marxism just meant strongly centralized management of government, and ownership of the means of production, and you know, very high social safety net and social equity. Um, this book kind of helped expand some of that, but also helped, I should say, it helped expand some of that, but it didn't help me understand some of the other things too. Just a little bit of, like about that, but um,
Yeah, I don't think it doesn't articulate like so the difference between a mixed economy and a command economy.
yeah,
Um,
or
I
even like you had mentioned earlier, just a moment ago, like the travesty of where socialism has been seen historically and
yeah,
today. It's not such a pretty picture.
and that's
Um,
most people's point of reference, especially older people are
yeah.
thinking Venezuela, Mao Zedong, Stalin,
And maybe
and
for good reason. You know,
yeah,
like I think that that's part of the analysis here. I don't want to take for granted that another thing that's kind of in this book is that it doesn't really address those, and it kind of like dismisses them as just saying that like socialism hasn't really been achieved in the world, which is kind of um like a deflection, I
yeah.
believe.
Do they answer the question? There's a chapter titled Doesn't socialism always end in dictatorship? Do you remember them giving a compelling answer to that question? I don't know if they even take that seriously, really.
No, the thrust of that essay is about how capitalism has kind of led to dictatorship, and the United States has enabled dictators. And there's
Yes.
also like a hint of an argument about how America, or capitalism as they describe, um, also like led to the enabling of authoritarian regimes that really thwarted you know, labor rights movements and social class movements in those countries. They cite, you know, in Latin America during the 1970s and 1980s. And suffice it to say, I'm not myself independently knowledgeable about these things, so I can't comment more than just to
Yeah.
say what they said.
But that's changing the subject from the real question, doesn't socialism always lead to dictatorship?
Exactly. It's just like this very weird. It's like an obfuscation, in
Yes.
saying like, you're answering the question with a question. Like, doesn't socialism lead to dictatorship? Well, doesn't capitalism lead to dictatorship? You know, and I'm left wondering. Uh,
Yeah, yeah.
and that takes place a few times.
And my primitive understanding of Marxism is that you have a period where you might have a dictator. That might be called the dictatorship of the proletariat. I'm not sure. I don't know really formally. But the idea is that you actually give up your dictator and it becomes a leaderless utopia where it is the workers, uh, like some kind of ant hive or something, just all kind of interlocking and working together with no formal head. Um, but that never seems to happen, and you do end up with Stalins and Mao Zedongs.
So I'm actually curious. That brings out a question for me. We've talked about this a little bit, but why start here and not with like the Communist Manifesto? Um,
That's a good question.
I
Part of
have an answer. Well,
part of it is not wanting to overwhelm ourselves with text that is both 150 years old and translated from German. I think there's a quote from Marx in here that I found completely obscure. I had no idea what they were talking about. Do you remember that?
um, I don't. I mean, I know that they cited one about how capitalism, um, like almost like inherently prevents like racial equity or something, and there was, I don't know. They
Something like
cite
that.
Marx
But
a few
but the
times.
wording, yeah, but the
That I
wording of
think we
that
might
is
be
just,
thinking about the same one.
yeah, it's just brutal. And but that's a shallow reason maybe not to read Marx. But I I tend to have a bias that later people are better at explaining the theory. I don't go to Charles Darwin to learn about evolution because that theory has been more fully developed and more fully explained now.
Yeah, so like that's part of it for me is that actually. And then the other part is um and this seems evidenced further through the book, but my intuition always was that whatever Marx theorized doesn't seem to have been fully achieved. Like I think
Yeah,
one thing I understand, and let me just say, like I'm not I'm someone who like has studied foreign policy and international relations and so like I am somewhat aware of like what we call socialist regimes, and they don't seem at all like what I've heard get described as Marxist socialism. And they seem different from one another in different ways. So I think what I needed to do, and one of the reasons we read this book and we'll read another book about socialism, I just really need to learn the ABCs and then the DEFs, really the A to the Z. So the next book from this will be a little bit more technical, but really focused on like socialism today. Because like I'm not even really concerned about the question like what does socialism mean? I'm curious about the question, what does socialism look like today?
yeah,
Because I think that you can go like, what does liberal democracy mean? Okay, there's like so many different ways that you can define that, but like I think the really important question that it always matters is what does liberal democracy look like? There's like the concept, the abstract, but then the practice. And I'm really interested in that.
yeah. One of the more interesting essays that we felt was stronger in this book dealt with money, and it was talking about how basically we should reframe how we think about taxation. That this libertarian framing of you earn all of your gross wages and then the government needs to take some is wrong because all of society, all of the individuals, all of the businesses rely on the public education, the road systems, the court systems, the just everything about our government um, allows this society to function. So it's the government's money to begin with. It's the article was should don't the rich deserve their money? That was it, and it
Yeah.
ended by saying the rich don't deserve all their money; they're just holding it for us, or something like that, which I thought was kind of flippant. But there was an interesting framing of how we should think about taxes and how it's basically a bookkeeping trick to think of it as you earning
That is a
gross
quote,
wages. Yeah,
a direct quote from the book or from the author.
yeah. that, yeah, that we should have, I think you called it pre-taxed wages,
Yeah, I don't exactly know what to, but pre-tax wages or something.
where you only see the net pay.
Yeah.
Um,
Or like another way of describing it is that like when you're so like right now you get paid a wage and like that wage is just a wage. It's just a number with no tax attached. In a sense, like you would basically factor the tax rate in to whatever wage someone is being paid. Um, I don't think that that's like a concrete example because like I think this is one of the things I was left hungry to learn is like what does that mean?
yeah.
But just in terms of like my intuition and how I would describe it, that's what I think of when I think of what they're describing.
Um, because of course, if you keep everything exactly the same and just change how the bookkeeping is done, that doesn't actually solve your problems. That essay calls for some progressive policy proposals. It calls for universal health care, expanded social security, rebuilding infrastructure, but it's really not necessarily articulating something radically socialist. Um, and part of the thing that we're struggling with is does this just mean be Denmark? Does this just mean be more like Sweden, or does it mean something more radical for monetary policy or otherwise?
Yeah, like exactly. Like that's one of the questions I have is like I think I don't see why aggressively taxing wealth isn't can't take place
In a
without
capitalist
yeah,
economy.
like we can just tax wealth, like the things that Bernie Sanders talks about. Tax on, certain stock trades and, reforming capital gains tax exemptions, um, things like that, which are or even just keep it contained to labor, to keep it contained to labor, even just keeping labor getting taxed after the money is issued to you. The IRS and state governments tax that money. That's the regime that we currently live in. You get your money and then the government takes it before you before you even get it in your hands. But
Mm-hmm.
that's I don't see why you can't keep that and do the cool progressive things that I believe that we need to do. And I agree with you. I was not that part of the question was not answered in that essay.
Yeah, I'll go to another example that I found not compelling. This is from the Kenny Loggins essay. Um, they talk about how you can, if you're working at a $15 an hour job, 60 hours a week, um, you're earning that company a lot more than $15 an hour in your time, in the time that you're there. So you as a worker will never see the profits from the business. And in a socialist economy, you could see more of the profit, uh, and you could either choose to work less for the same amount, or just get much more, you know, value from your labor. And it's like that doesn't, in a clear-cut way, follow, because if you have two factories that are doing the same thing, and suddenly the world goes socialist, what if one factory decides to keep things the way they are, but they reinvest in better equipment? What if they're a mill and they invest in better mills, and the other one just, all the workers just have more money for whatever they want? Now one is going to outcompete the other, right? Or are we giving up competition entirely? I'm not really sure what any of this looks like.
So that's something I never really actually thought of. I think that that's a really interesting argument. I think competition is one of those things that is a really necessary function of not just capitalism, or maybe it's my neoliberal education coming out, but I think competition is an important facet just in terms of like administering services and developing technologies and providing things to people. Um, I think the thing that I'm really wondering is like, what does it mean to transfer ownership, like to eliminate private property or to like integrate to make all so what I thought of when I heard that argument in the book was like, oh, okay, so all companies are suddenly going to be profit sharing. Like you can just why don't you just mandate profit sharing? Like I it seems like I don't really know what it means when we talk about like labor ownership or whatever, or like eliminating of the means of production. Like private property and property rights are like very integral to our legal system, and we live in a very legalistic society. I don't know what that world looks like, and I don't know if we should be persuaded by the argument made here, because it doesn't explain. Like I'm not one of those people that like you always have to. Sometimes like I think the thrust of an argument is compelling enough, but the thrust of this argument is not compelling. I think it's awfully radical and it needs to be defended a little bit more, or like explained more. Um, that this was probably the strongest example. There were a few different instances in this book where I was kind of like, I don't really think that the essayist did a good job at explaining or making their case. Um,
Yeah, it was a very brief essay. It was actually by Bhaskar Sunkara, the editor and founder of Jacobin, which is kind of unfortunate. But yeah, he draws this distinction between private property, which he says is the things that give you power over others. So he lists factories, banks, offices, natural resources, utilities, communication, and transportation infrastructure. No one can own that stuff. You could add land, I assume. I guess. I actually don't know. But your Kenny Loggins records, that's personal. That's fine. You can own that. But all of the big things, the means of production, natural resources, no one owns that anymore except the government or the people abstractly in a broad sense. But just doesn't walk through the implications of that, really.
Yeah, or even clearly, like I still am wondering, like what distinguishes personal property from private property. Like I just am not quite sure. Like, and also like like if I'm and I don't support like extractive resources necessarily, but like if I'm a coal mining company and I take coal, and that coal's in like the possession of my company, is it like not in the possession? Is it like owned by the state? Like, is that, and then like how far does that go? Like, does the state own the metal that's like used to make an iPhone? Um, like I like, and then administratively, like what does that mean? And then like how is that like fundamentally, how is that different from personal property? Because the personal property is private.
Yeah.
Like private just means sanctioned by an entity, owned by an entity exclusively. So like I don't really even know if they explained it, or if they like you said, if they explained what the implications would be, um, which is like a radical thing. I think um, it's kind of like taken for granted. Like at least they think it's taken for granted. Not for me.
Yeah. No, not at all.
Um, but yeah, no, I mean, there were a few essays where I was kind of left, and we've kind of brushed on this, but um, the ugliness of socialism, I think the authors were kind of like they took for granted the positivity of socialism,
Yeah.
and also another thing that I found interesting, and find very interesting just as a principle in thinking about society, is like people's political engagement. There was an earlier essay. Let me just see if I can find it. Oh, but at least capitalism is free and democratic, right? And basically the argument, I think it's that essay, but basically the argument in one of the essays, I think it's that one, is that what we really need is a system in which like people are more involved in the provision of services and in the decisions that governments make. Um, I don't necessarily know if I'm convinced of that. I don't. I want to tread lightly. I think it's idealistic, maybe. I think that one of the things that's interesting to me about public administration is that there's like the political science aspect of it, like what you think government should do, and then there's like the administrative aspect, like how the thing gets done. The administrative aspect is like very technical and like wonky, and requires a lot of background knowledge, and I don't know if like
You want Joe
all of
Sixpack doing
us,
it. Yeah.
yeah, if all of us should be holding the lever and pulling the lever at the same time. I don't but at the same time, I'm sensitive to the fact that like this is a country that disenfranchised many people and prevents people from political power in many ways. Um, I don't necessarily know what to do with that, but I think it's just one thing that is very um, like generalized, and also um, I don't know how to necessarily use the term, but like it's just taken for granted.
Yeah.
It's begging the question.
I use that expression in my notes. Yes.
Yes,
Begging the
they
question does not mean, this is maybe pedantic English major me, does not mean prompts the
yeah,
question
no, no.
or encourages one to ask or something. It's a technical like argument term. It's a logical fallacy for assuming the truth of your own argument. They do
Yeah,
that constantly. There is this better way, and therefore capitalism is evil. So they assume the goodness of socialism. They also assume the badness of capitalism. We mentioned this before we got on air, that they kind of blithely summarize the history of the 20th century and late 19th century wars of America as like clear cut wrong, and many of them are imperialist and senseless. But I mean, they don't give any attention to the idea that World War II was a just war, or that we had a need to fight the Nazis. Um, they don't give any attention to the idea that the Korean War at least split North and South Korea.
well, and they had an essay about the subject, like aren't some
Yeah,
wars justified? And the author did not answer that question.
not at all.
Um, so, but again, like I think that that's like an advocative piece. Like I think that they kind of want to. This is interesting. I don't know if I want to make this plug, but I'm going to do it. So, like they are almost wanting to talk about the good and a little bit about the bad, but not the ugly. We
Yeah,
have an organization called the Reasoned Vegan. And at the Reasoned Vegan, we really do make a conscious effort to talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly of veganism. I think it's just about being honest. It's not, I think that there's an advocative element to what our organization does. And I think it's kind of lost on what this organization seems to be doing, because it seems to me that there's kind of like this timidity about addressing the ugliness.
yeah,
Really, at every single point in this book, um, every time there's a suggestion of, you know, the problems of Stalinist Russia, like it's often attributed to Stalin, but like not necessarily like the ideals of communist revolution. Um, and I think it's circumspect. Um, to be the most diplomatic about that.
yeah. Um, I I want to pivot, I guess, to social justice, because there's a large,
Yeah,
well, there's a contingent of essays that are, um, socialists don't care about race, do they? Socialists don't care about women's issues, do they? And again, this is pitched to a younger audience, and there may be some people from that background, some people who are saying, I come out of the feminist tradition, I come from a critical race theory background, or something like that. Um, aren't these socialists are just like dirty crust punks that sleep on their friends' couches and rag on capitalism? They're not really interested in women's issues. They're not really interested in race issues, and this has been a longstanding historical point of contention, really. I think between social justice and minority rights and workers' rights. When you're marching for women's suffrage, do you have black women alongside you? Do you have them at the back of the march? What if society's ready for one part of our message, but they're not ready for the other? Do we hinder one movement in order to be morally consistent? There's been many ugly incidences of racism within some quarters of leftist politics. But the general message is we're stronger together, and it's this kind of like intersectional ethos where it's all interlocking. Uh, I don't really have a big issue with those essays. I think they more or less make sense to me. How about you?
I was very interested by them. I think that they make sense to me. I think it's not something that I would have intuitionally understood. So I'm glad that this is one of the things about the book. Like, and I think let me just say, like, we've done a lot of kind of like talking about what we'd like to have learned, or maybe what we thought were insufficient about the book, but I largely thought the book was good. I mean, I think if it didn't, if I didn't, it didn't help me learn new information. It helped me understand things better. I'm someone who's very interested in social equity and, you know, shifting power imbalances and however else you want to describe it. But I never really thought of in this explicit and direct way, the relationship between, you know, labor rights and social rights and racial rights and you know, ethnic and gender rights and all of it really. Um, so I think it
Yes,
was really interesting to me.
because they are genuinely intertwined. You're right.
They are well,
That's the
and
point. Yeah.
yeah, well, and I think that I never really it's like kind of weird, right? Like it's one thing to kind of say something, but then it's like then it hits you. Like I think it's something that maybe like if you asked me about, I would have said, yeah, sure, they are definitely linked, but I don't think it really I understood clearly what that meant until this essay. Um and even let me just say I listened to a podcast, a Jacobin podcast today. It was a discussion that they had a few days ago, but this author was talking about, you know, past labor rights movements and current labor right movements and how a problem has been that labor rights advocates and activists are, um, for whatever reason, unwilling to integrate racial equity into the work of talking about labor rights. Um, you know, so it's a seems to be a consistent theme in their work. It's a very interesting concept. I'm grateful for learning about it. There was a section in there about Martin Luther King and how well Martin Luther King Jr. and how Martin Luther King Jr. At least as the argument goes in the book, what you know, got a little bit more democratic socialist leaning towards the you know his later years in his work and unfortunately
Yeah,
you know
really a
close to
lot
his
more.
passing. Yeah, you know, and you know, and so that was an interesting thing. They cited a speech that he talked about where he really talked about kind of explicitly how like we need to it like I actually forget. I don't want to paraphrase because I don't think I can accurately describe, but I'll say the thrust of what he was saying in that was that capitalism is the root for a lot of inequity, and that needs to change. Which is like a
Yes.
general theme that I think, you know, really you don't need to be a socialist to agree with that.
Yeah.
Um,
And he was planning a march on Washington for poor people, if I recall, as he was dying. I don't know if that was as he was assassinated. Um, but he was saying, look, I like just like we were talking about intersectionality. I care about the poor white person who's in a trailer. Also, that makes sense as a moral issue. And he stuck his neck out to create um, opprobrium from the establishment at the time, the administration, against the Vietnam War. That was another thing they went over, right? He stood up for his principles,
yeah.
and that's little known because I think Martin Luther King has just kind of gotten a sainthood, and we think of him as kind of like harmless and just like a pillar of liberal multiculturalism, just kind of bland and flavorless nowadays. But he was actually pretty radical. Um,
Yeah, I remember them saying the author was saying in the book that he even got a little more radical than some of the people he was working with at the time. Um, you know, and then they were even saying in that essay actually about how the I forget the name of the organization, but basically like a socialist organization at the time actually took up a case for a woman whose sons were killed um, in a racist killing. And at the time, the NAACP would not take the case, but the socialist group did. You know, just as a kind of argument for why they um,
they have early and
they
often,
you
yeah,
know well why they
right,
really are serious
yeah,
and why they've been there the whole time. Like I think one thing that I was interested by in this book was that there's kind of like this theme of like we've been here the whole time. You know, they talked
yes,
about Eugene Debs from like the 1917, you know, and like, you
yeah.
know, the labor rights movements of the 1930s, different places around the world, the revolution in Germany, um, you know, in the 50s after uh, World War II. But Um, and I think that's an interesting thing. I do want to find the name of the organization just in fairness.
The one that took up the
The
case
one
of the
that took up the
racist kill.
case of the
Yeah,
racist killer.
it's like the
Um,
World Socialist,
I have it here.
International Socialist, something like that. Yeah, and I
It's
was
not much to
surprised.
flip through.
Yeah, I was surprised that the NAACP at the time did not take that case on.
Yeah, well, and I think that it really makes me, and this is why I kind of am leaning towards democratic socialism, because it really makes me wonder about the, I don't know how to put it necessarily, but just kind of like the the get to itsmanship. Like these are people who are really committed to their values. Eugene Debs ran for the presidency while in a jail cell and won like a significant number of votes at the time. Um, these are people who are very serious about their principles. The organization is uh, the Communist Party and the International Legal Defense,
Good,
which were
good.
two communist organizations.
Shout out to them.
Um, well, and shout out to socialist organizations, maybe. I think that like it's just an interesting thing. Another thing I found interesting in the book was, this is just a totally different subject, but they talked about,
Can I interrupt you then? I just wanted to say about that. Hold that thought then. I just
yeah,
wanted to say that I think you're right that socialism or at least a class-based analysis of the world offers a more unified and bigger vision that the left should aspire to than a lot of these social justice movements on their own. Because I'm thinking of the feminist argument where they were saying why feminists should be socialists, why socialists should be feminists, and the argument is that you should look at how, I hate to say it, but kind of shallow and bankrupt the feminist movement is without any kind of real class-based engagement. You get Sheryl Sandberg and Hillary Clinton, to be honest. If it's just about women first, and we're going to stand up for the same hierarchies as before, it's not really. There's that somewhat famous tweet like. Republicans say 10 people should own the world who are fabulously wealthy. Democrats say, and 5 of them should be women. And it's like, it just shows how without a class-based analysis, you're left with something absurd like that.
well, I also think like just to that point, I think that we're getting to like a point in the world where like it's just like veganism, where like you don't have a choice. We really don't have many choices but to look this current regime in the face and wonder if there are some inherent or deeply embedded flaws,
There
where
are.
you need to, like, maybe at a certain point, like you just want to talk about getting women in the boardroom and getting women, in the workforce, and you want to have integrated workforces. Um,
Yeah, talk about
well, I mean, which
negotiating
are
skills.
literally labor issues.
Yeah,
But
they're
talking
important.
about classism is really talking about, it's about transcending racial ethnic labels, um, but also recognizing racial and ethnic labels as being part of the same kind of like pie, for
Yeah,
lack of a better way of putting it. And you just can't, like, when we're in a situation where like we all know the facts about like the 1% and the way that income inequality is so stark and crazy. Um, it's irresponsible not to integrate like a classist or class equity framework into thinking about social justice.
truly. Neither
One
works
of the
without
things
the
they
other.
make in this argument in the book was, one of the arguments that they make was the civil, not to say the civil rights movement was born out of this necessarily, the author didn't say that, but one factor in the generation of the civil rights movement was the fact that Black people just were not able to engage with the economy.
Yes,
um you know
huge.
so that's an interesting dimension. I'm
Yeah.
actually persuaded by that, even though I'm not historically, it seems persuasive to me intuitionally.
Yes.
um you know
because the post World War II, the GI Bill, the real estate market, the way the world was after World War II in America, it was the greatest engine of wealth that really the world has ever seen. I mean, it was just extraordinary growing up. Like you couldn't, I mean, the average white American male, I guess, kind of stepped in it, and you couldn't help but build up, amass a sort of wealth. And that's why you see the income disparity between black and white Americans isn't nearly as big as the wealth disparity. And it was that engine of wealth creation, largely through home ownership and college educations through the GI Bill, that African Americans were locked out of.
Yeah, so
So
like
I found that persuasive too.
all of that, and I think it's just a really interesting perspective. I think it is persuasive for me in thinking
Mm-hmm.
about democratic socialism. I think again, I have a lot of questions, but it stirs something in me. I think my heart was always in that direction, but I don't think I had the words for it until I read them in this book in a lot of ways.
But again, and this we might be edging towards a closing note here. I I need them to articulate something more concrete than they have. And they've said, hey, France and Sweden started to move towards this in the 70s, a kind of socialism. But then Reaganomics and Thatcherism kind of crushed that. Hey, it started to look good in Latin America with the pink tide in Bolivia and Venezuela and Ecuador and Brazil. But actually, American interventionism crushed that. Hey, it looked good under Michael Manley's government in Jamaica. It looked good under the Democratic Socialism of Salvador Allende in Chile. I'm reading these notes from notes I took. But they don't really even go into the details of those things, and they're just like doomed fantasies. And in some ways, it's a story you can tell yourself. The story you haven't told yourself is no, I'm sorry. The music unheard is sweeter than the music heard. Right? There's a famous Keats poem that's sort of to that effect. The economic system that you can dream of is better than the one you can actually point to. And I worry that there's a real problem that we're facing.
That's a very pretty quote. But so I do want to just close out by saying an interesting thing, at least something that I found interesting. But at the time when FDR was doing a lot of his super liberal stuff that we all look back on generally well in history, the New Deal, um, one of the authors was saying that a lot of those ideas and concepts were developed by democratic socialist scholars. Um, so there's a little bit of that, like we were always here kind of argument, but then
Yeah.
there's also like a little bit of like a tinge of like, if you look in the right places and you look long enough, eventually you'll realize that like this might be the way to go. I think that um, I think that's instantiated, or at least I interpret that as being instantiated from the example with Martin Luther King Jr. and also the reforms through the New Deal, um, where it's just kind of like if and for anyone like I really do think maybe we don't end up on socialism world, but for anyone who's soberly looking at the facts and the current system and even the past systems, I'm sure had the same issues and vulnerabilities. It's irresponsible not to want to dismantle the current capitalistic regime we live in today. I think it's just really incontrovertible. Um, and I think that that's probably been the case for a long time. I think that there are many questions about the viability of socialism if it has been such a long-running struggle. Struggle's a theme throughout this book, and throughout socialist literature, as I understand it. Um, but if this struggle has never actualized into any type of model, um, like you've been suggesting, I think it does raise a question about the ideals. I don't know. I mean, I want to learn more. I think this was a really it was a really good book, um, but it was a really not so good book in a lot of ways. Um, I'm someone who really wants well, whatever about my interest in wanting to learn. or how I learn, I just think that there's a lot left unsaid in this book. Um,
I couldn't agree more. It's really just scratching the surface, and it doesn't
yeah,
necessarily give fair reading to its opponent's arguments. I want to echo your point about FDR. I think Thomas Frank or somebody like Thomas Frank made the point that these also were not technocrats that were in FDR's cabinet. These were like farmers and teachers and kind of like maverick academic types, or people outside of the mainstream academic sphere. They were not the big-headed people that we have in at the forefront of liberal economic policies today. These were people with bold visions who were workers. They were people of the earth, and that seemed to work a lot better for FDR. But there's one other bold thing that you said, which is that you're the establishment public administration guy. You say it's irresponsible not to dismantle capitalism. Dismantle is a strong word. Do you want to stand by that?
the way things are is really, it's really despicable. Like the fact that Jeff Bezos didn't pay any federal income tax, well, that Amazon didn't pay any federal taxes, the fact that income inequality is like incredibly stark, that and at the same time most people can't afford transactions of like 40, well, when I say most people, the study shows that research has shown that about 44% of people cannot afford expenses of more than $400. I think that the current regime is indefensible. I think it's truly indefensible. I maybe I won't say dismantle capitalism, but we really need to chip away largely at the tax structure and the very weak antitrust structure of this country. Our antitrust systems are like ill-equipped to handle the kinds of things that Amazon is doing to deal with vertical monopolies. That's not how
Yeah, I
antitrust laws.
I understand. I understand where you're coming
Yeah.
from, and I appreciate all those arguments. It's just that I always wonder what happens after the revolution, and
Yeah.
that's the concern I'm coming from. Do we have something better? Do we want to pursue revolution?
Well, it doesn't mean
Because
like, I mean, I'm an iPhone.
yeah,
I'm someone who's an iPhone lover. I think that there's some merit to corporations being corporations.
yeah,
I'm not saying don't make your money, honey boo boo, whoever you are, but make sure your workers have money. Make sure that you're not making so much money that you're just hoarding billions of dollars. I mean, I truly believe that people shouldn't be billionaires. I don't think that's really that extreme. I think the fact that people are billionaires, it makes me uncomfortable. Because what good does anyone do with a billion? What? So I am radical to that extent.
yeah. I don't really agree with that. I think that being a billionaire means that you've organized the world in a complicated way to make things better than they are now. But maybe I agree that there
Hopefully, I
should be
mean,
more marginal tax rates,
oh
to,
yeah,
to the degree that there should that
there's a
should
lot
exist.
you can
But
do, like without turning
yeah,
into a socialist regime.
but
Like
yeah,
there's a lot of room, and that's the other thing about this is there's a lot of room between where we are now and like that world.
the
Increasing
command economy
marginal,
worlds.
the
Yeah,
command economy world, that
yeah,
like cliched or archetype of like Marxist socialism. Which I don't even know how relevant it is as a
yeah.
model. Um, you know,
But
so again, it doesn't have to be a dichotomy between capitalism and socialism, but if we are going to talk about socialism, I would really like it to be a little bit more so. I mean, they did a really great job. I mean, I thank Jacobin for even doing the work. And I've since read their articles and I've listened to their podcasts a little bit more. um so I'm looking forward to learning more. I think I will learn more in that than I will from the book.
yeah, but it's a clarion call to learn more. That's really what the book is. It's
Yeah,
just whetting your
they
appetite.
used that
So
phrase in the book.
clarion call,
Yeah.
or oh wow,
Yeah.
don't remember.
Yeah, Marx had a clarion call telling people something.
That must be why it's in
I
my
think it
head.
was like "Don't Let Up" or something to that effect. Like
Yeah,
the struggle doesn't stop. Um,
but I
Interesting stuff.
yeah,
We'll have a more substantive conversation. The other part of these book clubs is really we're not going to learn if we understand that as reasonable people, we're not going to learn everything we need to know from one book. Suffice it to say, we chose kind of a more easy book, but the learning really comes from the taking in of a lot of information and reflection, and then these kinds of conversations. When we talk next about our book on our book club, we'll review another socialist book, a book about socialism, and hopefully by that time really be at a place where we can kind of have some conclusive beliefs. A part of the discourse from discourse is really
discourse from Discord.
discourse from discourse from discord. Part of the purpose is really being serious about ideas, and if we're serious about ideas, we shouldn't pretend that we can understand everything from one or two books.
Certainly, certainly that's true.
Yeah,
But on the other hand, you become more knowledgeable than the great mass of people when you read just 3 books. Read 3 or 4 good books in a row on a given topic, and you're on your way. You become conversant with the theory of it, and that's what we're hoping to do and to model here.
yeah, yeah. So we'll do our next book club next, and obviously we have other videos that you have the opportunity to see how we go about our flow here. But most of all, just continue the discussion. And if anyone has any good books on socialism that they'd like to recommend, post them in the comments below.
We'd welcome we'd welcome it. All
Yeah.
right. Thank you, everyone.
Have a good whatever part of the day it is where you are.